is Ray Snow. I do not live in Bonita, but I did at one time. And I am a almost Florida native. I, I grew up in North Florida in Tallahassee, which has lots of history, a lot of historic cemeteries, lots of stories to tell. So when I moved down to Bonita in 1989, there was a little cemetery down the road, and it kind of said, come look at me. So I did. I'd like to talk to you about the Bonita Springs Historic Cemetery, which is located at the corner of Bonita Beach Road and what is now called Imperial Parkway. The cemetery is historic in that we believe the first burials took place in the late 1800s, 1890s on property owned by the Walker family. I started to walk around out there and saw all the old graves and noticed that it was quite a historic cemetery, and somebody was placing flags on some of the VA marked veterans graves. So I started going down there and doing the same thing. And I started looking at how many dates indicated that many of these people who didn't have VA markers probably were veterans. So after that, I started researching and getting more information. And then the gentleman who had apparently been originally placing the flags passed away. So I started doing the flags. And then I was in a DAR chapter, the Estero Island chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they were doing flags up at Fort Myers Cemetery. And I said, well, I've got this little cemetery down in my neighborhood that could really use some volunteers. And so we started placing flags. And then we started having ceremonies for Veterans Day and Memorial Day. And then we got involved with Wreaths Across America. So we started raising money, and we have a ceremony for Wreaths Across America every December. And we place wreaths on all of our military veterans' graves. I keep researching the cemetery. I keep looking into it. I keep learning some of the stories. I try to link as many of the, especially the pioneer families, I try to link all them together with their relatives and their descendants that are there or maybe elsewhere. And it kind of grew like Topsy. The cemetery is owned by the two churches in the area, who were in the area at the time. The Walker family deeded the property to them. And it needs help because they don't have the funds to do anything beyond the mowing. We have groups that come over from the Lake Park, Palm Lake Resort, and they come over. I call them my Tuesday people. They come and do work on Tuesday because that's dumpster day. And they have been working very hard to keep the place nice. But of course, during summer, they are all out of town. They've all gone back north. Some of them will be back soon, and I'll see them back down there again. The Boy Scouts have several Eagle Scouts that have been coming down and doing some projects, which has been great because some of my veterans markers that have sunk below ground and been hidden are now picked up and now look pretty good. Even though they were intended to be at ground level, they couldn't stay that way because they kept getting mowed over. So I do continue to research as best I can stories about the people who are buried in the cemetery, trying to verify if any of the other ones are actually military veterans we didn't know about. It's an ongoing project. I try whenever possible to contact family members. As I said, I'm trying to connect everybody as the best I can. And then I also try to keep track of some of the more interesting stories about the cemetery. One of my favorites is the little grave of Amanda Curry. It has a homemade marker. Looks like it was made of concrete. And it drew me because the marker was written that she had been born. And it just kind of grabbed me as being, really genuine. And then I found out that after she passed away, her husband moved over to Glades County, and when his second wife died, he made her exactly the same marker with exactly the same wording, which I thought was extremely touching. And an interesting aside about Amanda Curry, her maiden name was Hicks, and her parents are buried there. Now, I had always heard the rumor that we have a Civil War veteran buried there, and the only one whose dates would fit would be her father, John Hicks, but I can't verify an actual service for him He would probably, since he was from North Florida, have been in the Confederate Army, but I can't verify him. I can verify another John Lee Hicks from another part of North Florida, but not him. So we'll just go with the legend that there may be a Civil War veteran buried there. Another one of my stories that kind of grabs me is a little lone marker that is in the wrong place in the cemetery for a gentleman who was probably an undocumented immigrant who was hit and killed by a car while riding his bicycle up off Bass Road in Fort Myers. And as an indigent with apparently no family, it fell to the local funeral home to provide burial services for him. But his grave was never marked until several years after his death. This marker shows up that ends up being put in the wrong place. And it's got his name, and it's got a little sentence, and his date of death. And that's all there is, because that's all that was on his death certificate. No one knows anything about the poor gentleman. Several members of a lot of the local families are there. And interestingly, some of the local families are not there. And a lot of them were buried up in Fort Myers, or in the case of the Leitner family, Mrs. Leitner inherited, she was from New York, and she inherited property from her father, and she and Keith Leitner moved to New York and were never here in Bonita after that, except to come visit. The other two other of my interesting stories, I have two Polish Army veterans. One of them was actually with the British Army after Poland got overrun by Hitler, and he fought as a tank commander. He was wounded 4 times. He had several decorations, and after he retired from teaching chemical engineering at the University of Detroit, he moved to Bonita Springs. And there are some newspaper articles about how he and his wife liked to travel, and they were constantly sharing their pictures and their slides with their neighbors in Bonita Shores at the social club there. Someone we think may have known Dr. Kowalczyk was a gentleman named Dombrowski. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Polish Army. I have not been able to find much about him, other than at some point in time he came under the administration of the Veterans Administration. So I was able to find him in their, what they call their master death file. Don't know much about his service other than he was a decorated lieutenant colonel in the Polish Army. I was able to talk or communicate at one point in time with somebody who was a great nephew of the family that adopted Mr. Dombrowski, but he was able to tell me that Mr. Dombrowski's wife had passed away, possibly in Canada, probably not in Europe, and that he had 2 adult children somewhere. And that's all we were able to find out about him. And so every time I come across a story, I try to make some kind of information about it. So that, as they say, the last time your name is spoken is the last time you will be remembered. So I think it's important to preserve the cemetery, to take care of it, to keep these stories alive, because this is part of our history. These graves are the silent witnesses to those who came before us. Well, I understand from Wilma Harvard, who is another member of an old pioneer family, that there was an area somewhere in the center of the old cemetery property they used to call Babyland. We've never been able to physically define it. The church has apparently acquired more property, so the cemetery is now larger than it had been. But we think it was up somewhere in that center part of the old section. There are quite a few babies in that area that are marked, but we've never been able to say, well, this is where the fence was, because apparently it was defined at some point in time. I would like to find out, among other things, what space is still available. That's the big mystery for the church, because there are so many unmarked burials there, or unfortunately so many of the families depended upon what we call the temporary funeral home marker to be a permanent marker, and it was not. They were often mowed over and lost. So I would like to see maybe a ground penetrating radar survey done that covers the entire cemetery so we can see if we can find what are the unmarked burials. I would like to see the cemetery eventually get a better fencing system, and to preserve the character of the cemetery, because it's a lovely, quiet place. There have been damage to a lot of the trees over the various hurricanes. Some of them probably need help, and many of them we are afraid will eventually have to come down, and maybe we can get some trees planted in their place. I kind of think it would be nice that even though part of the drive is brick paved, I'd like to see the entire drive brick paved. I'd like more people to be aware it's there. A lot of people say, where is that? They drive by it every day, but they never really notice it. And it's like I said, this is history. This is part of the story of Bonita Springs. These people lived here. They worked here. They had families here. They died here. And so it's kind of like, this is part of our history. We need to, and if I can get some more of the old families to tell the stories, and maybe even one of these days we can do a cemetery tour and kind of tell these stories, get the people interested, get the people to know that, that this place deserves to be kept.
I walked my dog all the time in the cemetery, and I noticed all the veterans in there. And I believe I ran into Betsy.
Yes.
Yep. And she was from the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they do the wreaths across America, and they were looking for volunteers. So I went over, and maybe one or two other ladies, for the wreaths across America in December, and we placed the wreaths on all the veterans' markers. And my husband used to represent the Navy at that time. Then more people at the park got involved, like several of them, I would say 10 to 12 seasonals and some permanents. And they went over every Tuesday and Wednesday, and they cleaned debris in the park. The lady that kind of ran that, her name was Mary Lou, she said that there was 36 yards of debris picked up every week. They cleaned everything up. They installed a flag in the park. Well, they cleaned the debris up, cut down, like the bushes or whatever, and pick up the leaves and rake, things like that.
And you do that on a weekend or have a Tuesday?
Usually a Tuesday, Wednesday. There's several different volunteers each week that would help. That there's a lot of veterans buried there, and it's a very nice cemetery with, it's beautiful in there. Just because it's a landmark that is represents Bonita Springs, There's not too many cemeteries in Bonita Springs, I don't think. And it would be nice to have it be more represented. Well, it just makes you feel good, of course, because you're helping people, and I always like cemeteries. And I picked out one special one that is a military man. I don't remember his name, but he was also a beekeeper, and my husband was a beekeeper. So that one was special to me, and I always made sure that I got the wreath and put it on there. And, different names, I'd say, oh, that sounds like my father's name, or that sounds like my brother's name. And it just makes you feel good to walk around there. That's why I got involved, actually.
All right, hello, my name is Xavier Casanova. I was born in Naples. I lived in San Carlos for a little bit, but essentially born and raised here in Bonita Springs. Been here for the better half of 15 years. I've seen it grow into what it is today. It looks a lot nicer, to tell you what. But me and my friend here, Cole, we are part of Troop 109, and our involvement with the cemetery has been over the years. I joined our troop 6th grade. I was maybe 12, and ever since I can remember, our boys have been doing things there, whether we're participating in laying of the wreaths across the nation, or on 4th of July or for Veterans Day, we're placing American flags next to all the veterans. Um, Even as far to helping the boys get volunteer hours and doing community cleanups at the cemetery. We've always been doing something there, and it wasn't until recently with my Eagle project that we finally made a real solid impact that will be permanent.
Hi, my name is Cole Bridges. I've lived here my entire life. I was born here. I've been in this troop since 2018, since I was in 5th grade. Our troop has been doing this for years, even before I've been here. And it's been, we always, there's at least, right now, there used to be like 30 of us working there and doing stuff like that. But as after COVID, it's been dwindling a little more, but we're at like around 20 members. And there's several of us who are planning to do Eagle projects there that are doing the fence or doing the landscaping and doing the stones that we've been working on. Currently we have 10 Life Scouts who are planning on doing projects there. There's Dax, who's our patrol or SPL, or senior patrol leader, is planning on working on the fence soon, if he has already not done that. Who the other projects? I think there's another boy named Jack who's also working on the fence near the other side. I am personally planning on doing something with the weeds and all the plants that are damaging the stones near the backside of the cemetery.
Essentially, towards the end of a scouting life, you work towards your Eagle rank. It's essentially the last step in your scouting life, and what the biggest thing is your Eagle project. It's talked about the entirety of your scouting career, but essentially what it is scouting to be like Boy Scouts or Scouts of America. They want to see, after everything that you've learned and all the experience that you've done, what can you do to give back to your community? Because the big part of the scouting is what can you do for your community and how can you tie it in. So with your Eagle project, they want to see you outsourced to your local community, or anything else like that. But they want to see you outsourced. They don't want you to just put your own money into this, even if you can, just to solve something. They want to see you reach out to the community, gain a little bit of awareness, to see what you can help out. And so what I ended up doing was, growing up, we've been doing so much with the cemetery, and I always wondered, why didn't any of the other boys ever do an Eagle project there? It's not that the cemetery is in shambles or anything like that, but it's an older cemetery. It's been here since the beginning of Bonita Springs, when it was still a fishing town, and so it's not in the greatest condition. And I went, well, every time we go, there's always headstones that are lopsided or underneath, and you can't even see them anymore. And so I thought, well, what's something permanent that I can do that I know that the community will back me up on? And so what I did was I took 4 veteran headstones and I raised them back up because they were just either they were lopsided or toppled. I also took 2 of the veterans' wives and then raised their headstones as well, and 2 family headstones that had, or I guess towers, that had been there. I think one since 1923, and then the other one was really were a condition for the original death being, I think it was 1915, but after they were leaning, and so I made them straight. But in retrospect, I thought it was going to be a lot easier, and that's kind of where the community comes in. I was able to reach out to Mrs. Snow as my beneficiary, and she really helped me out, pick which ones would be the best to do. And I reached out to the New Life Church that kind of sponsors it and technically owns it, to see, hey, am I able to get the permission for this? Is it okay? And maybe getting in contact with the family members that were still alive. Sadly, only 2 of them were, and after reaching out extensively for about a month, I never got any headway, and so the church gave me the go-ahead. But it was my first time ever trying to get awareness for something, and reaching out to the community and raising a GoFundMe so I could raise funds for all the tools that I needed and the gravel in order for me to pack and raise them back up. It was a lot, but it really went to show me, it's the entirety of my scouting career, spanning from when I was first grade to now I'm in college. Um, it's crazy seeing how close that I am with the community now. I've met the past few mayors through scouting. I've met a lot of other people that are in like the local government here, and it's kind of crazy just to see, if you really put your hand out, the community will always give back. And so raising towards something that I've driven past my entire life. I mean, like it's been stated before, the cemetery really is, it's just there. There's nothing saying, Bonita Springs Cemetery, there's nothing not special about it, but it's just so hidden. Everybody drives past it, a lot of people don't know it's there. And I say, oh yeah, the cemetery on the intersection of Imperial and Bonita Springs, nobody knows what I'm talking about. And so to be able to raise awareness through my Eagle Project and create an everlasting permanent mark, it's something really great. And I like that, I've phased out. I earned my Eagle rank, but I've created kind of a stepping stone. The next few boys are also going to do their Eagle projects at that cemetery, and it's kind of like a statement saying, hey, you know what, Troop 109 in Southwest Florida, we're committed to this. We're committed to bettering the Bonita Springs Cemetery.
My project is similar, but there's a lot of plants and overgrown, there's just a lot of overgrown plants near the back side of the cemetery. I don't know if there's some that we're covering up or displacing some of the stones, and I was planning on tearing them all out and trying to uncover what's under there. There's also a lot of weeds near a former project that was a butterfly garden that I was also planning on pulling out. And there's also a lot of debris that are coming from a tree that has fallen down that has destroyed the fence that another project's working on, but I can also help get the debris off of the fallen tree. The cemetery itself comes from before Bonita Springs was even a town. It was a part of Naples back then, and it's just like a part of our history, our shared history as like people who've lived here, that I feel like it's best to preserve it. And like it preserves the people who've lived here before us and the people who will live here after us, for them to enjoy and for them to visit. It's just important for just the entire city to preserve. Always be prepared.
Hello, I'm Byron Lyles. I'm a third-generation lifetime resident of the town of Bonita Springs, and I'd like to talk a little bit today about the cemetery. The cemetery goes way back to the 1800s, and it was a plot of land that was donated by one of the earliest families that settled in this area. They settled in the little pioneer settlement known as Survey, and the name of the family was the Walker family. They had migrated from Central Florida, and they donated a plot of land for a cemetery and also some other things like a school, and the school was also a church. And so that was the beginning of the Bonita Springs Cemetery. And unfortunately, in that time, it was just a matter of burying people, and there was not much as far as records. And that was something that eventually became a problem in knowing who was buried there, because some of the markers probably was nothing more than a wooden cross or something like that, rather than granite. And but the cemetery just grew haphazardly. But originally the land was put in a trust to the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. And this was later on, though. That wasn't from the very beginning. And the Baptist Church took it on theirself to try to somewhat manage the burials there. And so my experience with the cemetery was as a child, um, and I would call it maybe the touchstone of the community. In other words, it was one foundation that has been here since the beginning, whereas most of the other landmarks and all have disappeared, along with the little settlement of Survey has disappeared. But some of the earliest people buried in the cemetery are well marked, and my original experience with it was that my father in the Baptist church was the one who usually selected the grave sites for people that was wanting to bury someone there. And because he knew most of the graves, unfortunately, he didn't make a list, or he didn't pass on to me who was buried where. I remember one time asking him if my great uncle was buried there, and he said yes, he was, but they didn't have a marker for his grave, and he said it's somewhere near the oak tree. So that's the way the cemetery was through my childhood, is some people knew where graves were and some people didn't know, but so they usually went to my father to ask where they could bury someone. And as my childhood, my connection to the cemetery was I helped my father on more than one occasion dig a grave. Back then there was no official person or organization that dug graves. I believe now that the graves are dug by the county with a backhoe, but back then they were dug just by people in the community, volunteers who used shovels. And one of the famous grave diggers was Cordell Smith. Cordell, of course, was our town, you might say our town character, but he was also really a significant part of the town of Bonita Springs. He's the one who planted the banyan tree. And Cordell liked to dig earth. He dug a long ditch along the roadbed. He took on himself to do drainage around town. And so he was always one of the grave diggers. And my father was one day digging a grave, and Cordell was one of the people digging it, and Cordell was in the grave hole and was digging, and his shovel hit a coffin that was buried that they didn't know was there. And Cordell screamed and jumped out of the grave hole and said that he would never dig another grave, and he took his shovel and left, and he never was on the grave digging committee again. But I myself did help my father and other men. I was only probably 14 at the time, maybe 13, dig several graves. And I've heard a lot of stories about people digging graves during my teenage years. But at some point, and I'm not certain of when, it became more organized. But what has always been a problem is lack of records and lack of designation of who's in charge of taking care of the cemetery, keeping records of the cemetery, and saying what can and can't be done there. So it's been a rather hodgepodge thing through the years. Unfortunately, a great deal of my family, which was one of the original settlers in this area, the Lyles family, they date back to the 1800s, very few are buried in the Bonita Springs Cemetery, and why that is, I'll never know. But they're buried primarily in Fort Myers Cemetery out on Michigan Avenue. And that would be my grandfather, my grandmother, and my grandfather's two brothers, Lawrence and Marvin, and all of their three daughters, and there's one of their sons. So one Lyle son, is buried at the Bonita Cemetery, and my father is buried in Naples. So we have very, ironically, very few people buried there, although we've had a great deal to do with the cemetery. One point of interest is my mother's sister. When my mother's family moved here from Georgia in the 20s, early 20s, 22 I think, and the very next year, 1923, their daughter, Montine, who was only 4 or 5 years old, died from what they thought was spinal meningitis at the time. And the nearest hospital or doctor was Fort Myers. She died on the way to Fort Myers because of the poor transportation at that time. And they buried her in the Bonita Springs Cemetery. So I have an aunt buried there from my mother's family. She was the only one from my mother's family that was buried there. They moved back to Georgia when my mother got married, and my mother is buried in Naples also. So her sister, Montaigne, at the time they made a attractive tombstone, but it was made out of concrete. And what I'm getting at is there's a lot of the older tombstones that were just poured concrete, and they deteriorate really badly. So there's a few tombstones in the cemetery. Right now, I was just there the other day. There was some tombstones that you couldn't read anything on them. They were totally deteriorated. The best, of course, is granite. The granite tombstones all look very well marked, and you can tell who's there. Now, in the case of my aunt, the 5-year-old girl that died, me and my cousin got together and we purchased a nice tombstone for her grave and replaced the old one because the old one was barely readable. I have it in my backyard at home. I can still read it a little, but so we have a nice tombstone there that people might think is relatively new grave, but it was in 1923 is when she was buried. And so I wander through there a lot and wonder about it. The cemetery is kept up fairly well, but not on a real great schedule. And I'm not sure of who's in charge. And so if I was to say what might be done about the cemetery, I would think is to the best of everyone's knowledge to get the record of who's buried there and make that a permanent record and have an actual someone from the city, maybe in the city, to be responsible for that department so that we could get on a firm footing for the little cemetery. It's in the, I would say it's in the area of a local landmark, and that they would also have a scheduled cleaning, possibly paid for by taxes, and could even have a transfer of the property to a nonprofit or something like that. But it would do well to keep it and keep it up and keep records. And that's what's been lacking through the years. There was an effort made a while back, and I'm not sure who instigated it, to actually survey the cemetery and mark the graves, mark the grave sites that existed. And my cousin, who worked for a engineering company, Wilson Miller in Naples, the Wilson Miller, another point that an effort was made, I think, to get better organized with the cemetery, and I'm not sure who instigated it, but there was a effort made to survey the cemetery and map out all the graves that were known, and that was performed by an engineering company that my cousin worked for, Wilson Miller in Naples. They did it gratis, and they had my cousin lead as the party chief to come down and survey the cemetery, which was rather fitting in that his father was the only Lyle's child that was of my grandparents that was buried in the cemetery, so he had more interest in it. And according to him, they mapped out the cemetery and they identified every grave in the cemetery that could be identified, and showed it on the plat, and that exists, and that should be public records and kept in a good place. I'm not certain where that is, and I talked to my cousin the other day, and he said he wasn't certain who had it, that he had given it to somebody, but wasn't sure of the ultimate location of it. The maintenance of the cemetery has evolved over the years, I suppose, but when I was a youngster, I would say 12 years old. I was in the Boy Scouts, and I know that was a project to the Boy Scout troop when I was in the troop, but we didn't do it on an absolute regular basis. I can only think of like 2 occasions that we went and we mowed the grass with push lawnmowers and hoes and shovels and rakes and cleaned up the whole cemetery. And I think it's been done that way periodically ever since. One organization or another organization would take it on themselves to give the cemetery a sprucing up, but no absolute organized maintenance of it. And I'm not certain if there is a maintenance of it right now that is on a regular scheduled basis or anything like that, but that would be another point that we could that should be addressed. To me, the significance of a cemetery is, I think back through history, that through even today, one of the greatest archaeological finds is our burial grounds. In fact, in old Bonita Springs, scattered throughout the community, the only remnant of the Seminole tribes that lived here are mounds, burial mounds. And they took, they had a great degree of pride in those. They buried some of the best things they had to live on. I think it's just something within humans that want to leave a mark, if you will, that they existed. And I think it's good that Bonita has this little cemetery that has, I can walk through. Unfortunately, I'm knowing more and more people there than I know in the community, to tell you the truth. I walk through the cemetery and I see so many stones of people that I've known through the years and had a relationship with, and now at 82 years old in this community, I can go to the store, I can come downtown, and I rarely ever see anyone that I know, much less have a relation with. So I guess I can walk through the cemetery and renew some old relations. I guess it's just a point that we just want to have remembrance of people that did live and that their life meant something.